Mormons evil in the name of religion. The Mountain Meadows Massacre, September 7th to 11th, 1857, was a series of attacks during the Utah War that resulted in the mass murder of at least 120 members of the Baker-Fancher wagon train. The massacre occurred in the southern Utah Territory at Mountain Meadows and was perpetrated by settlers from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, LDS Church, involved with the Utah Territorial Militia, officially called the Nauvoo Legion, who recruited and were aided by some southern Paiute Native Americans. The wagon train, made up mostly of immigrant families from Arkansas, was bound for California, traveling on the old Spanish trail that passed through the territory. After arriving in Salt Lake City, the Baker-Fancher party made their way south along the Mormon Road, eventually stopping to rest at Mountain Meadows. The party's journey occurred amidst hostilities between Mormon settlers and the U.S. government, with war hysteria rampant amongst the Mormons. Acting on rumors of hostile behavior on the part of the travelers, local Mormon militia leaders, including Isaac C. Haight and John D. Lee, made plans to attack them as they camped at the meadow. The leaders of the militia, wanting to give the impression of tribal hostilities, persuaded Southern Paiutes to join with a larger party of militiamen disguised as Native Americans in an attack on the wagon train. During the militia's first assault, the travelers fought back, and a 5-day siege ensued. Eventually, fear spread among the militia's leaders that some immigrants had caught sight of the white men, likely discerning the actual identity of a majority of the attackers. As a result, militia commander William H. Dame ordered his forces to kill the travelers. By this time, the travelers were running low on water and provisions, and allowed some members of the militia, who approached under a white flag, to enter their camp. The militia members assured the immigrants they were protected, and after handing over their weapons, the immigrants were escorted away from their defensive position. After walking a distance from the camp, the militiamen, with the help of auxiliary forces hiding nearby, attacked the travelers. The perpetrators killed all the adults and older children in the group, in the end sparing only 17 young children ages 6 and under. Following the massacre, the perpetrators buried some of the remains but ultimately left most of the bodies exposed to wild animals and the climate. Local families took in the surviving children, with many of the victims' possessions and remaining livestock being auctioned off. Investigations, which were interrupted by the American Civil War, resulted in 9 indictments in 1874. Of the men who were indicted, only Lee was tried in a court of law. After 2 trials in the Utah Territory, Lee was convicted by a jury, sentenced to death, and executed by firing squad on March 23, 1877. Historians attribute the massacre to a combination of factors, including war hysteria about a possible invasion of Mormon territory and Mormon teachings against outsiders during the Mormon Reformation. Scholars debate whether senior leadership in the LDS Church, including Brigham Young, directly instigated the massacre or if responsibility for it lay only with the leaders of the militia. Baker-Fancher Party. In early 1857, the Baker-Fancher Party was formed from several groups, mainly from Marion, Crawford, Carroll, and Johnson counties in northwestern Arkansas. They assembled into a wagon train at Beller's Stand, south of Harrison, to emigrate to Southern California. The group was initially referred to as both the Baker Train and the Perkins Train, but later referred to as the Baker-Fancher Train, or Party. It was named after Colonel Alexander Fancher, who, having already made the journey to California twice before, had become its main leader. By contemporary standards, the Baker-Fancher Party was prosperous, carefully organized, and well-equipped for the journey. They were joined along the way by families and individuals from other states, including Missouri. The group was relatively wealthy and planned to restock its supplies in Salt Lake City, as did most wagon trains at the time. Interactions with Mormon settlers. At the time of the Fanchers' arrival, the Utah Territory, though legally a democracy, was effectively a theocracy under the leadership of Brigham Young, the second president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, LDS Church, who had established colonies along the California Trail and the Old Spanish Trail. U.S. President James Buchanan had recently issued an order to send federal troops to Utah, which led to rumors being spread in the territory about its motives. Young issued various orders that urged the local population to prepare for the arrival of the troops. Eventually, Young issued a declaration of martial law. The Baker-Fancher Party was refused provisions in Salt Lake City and chose to leave there and take the Old Spanish Trail, which passed through southern Utah. In August 1857, the Mormon apostle George A. Smith traveled throughout the southern part of the territory instructing Mormon settlers to stockpile grain. While on his return trip to Salt Lake City, Smith camped near the Baker-Fancher Party on August 25, 1857, at Corn Creek. They had traveled the 165 miles, 266 kilometers, south from Salt Lake City, and Jacob Hamblin suggested that the wagon train continue on the trail and rest their cattle at Mountain Meadows, which had good pasture and was adjacent to his homestead. While most witnesses said that the Fanchers were in general a peaceful party whose members behaved well along the trail, rumors spread about their supposed misdeeds. United States Army Brevet Major James Henry Carleton led the first federal investigation of the murders, and the findings were published in 1859. He recorded Hamblin's account that the train was alleged to have poisoned a spring near Corn Creek, resulting in the deaths of 18 cows and 2 or 3 people who ate the contaminated meat. Carleton interviewed the father of a child who allegedly died from this poisoned spring and accepted the sincerity of the grieving father. He also included a statement from an investigator who did not believe the Fancher Party was capable of poisoning the spring, given its size. Carleton invited readers to consider a potential explanation for the rumors of misdeeds, noting the general atmosphere of distrust among Mormons for strangers at the time, and that some locals appeared jealous of the Fancher Party's wealth. Killings and aftermath. On Friday, September 11, 1857, 2 militiamen approached the Baker-Fancher Party wagons with a white flag and were soon followed by Indian agent and militia officer John D. Lee. Lee told the battle-weary emigrants that he had negotiated a truce with the Paiutes. Under Mormon protection, the wagon train members would be escorted safely back to Cedar City, 36 miles, 58 kilometers, away, in exchange for turning all of their livestock and supplies over to the Native Americans. Accepting this offer, the emigrants were led out of their fortification, with the adult men being separated from the women and children. The men were paired with a militia escort, and when the signal was given, the militiamen turned and shot the male members of the Baker-Fancher Party standing by their side. The women and children were then ambushed and killed by more militia that were hiding in nearby bushes and ravines. Members of the militia were sworn to secrecy. A plan was set to blame the massacre on the Native Americans. Survivor Nancy Sophrona Huff was taken away along with her family's possessions by John Willis to reside at his house until she was returned to relatives in Arkansas 2 years later. The militia did not kill small children who were deemed too young to relate what had happened. Nancy Huff, one of the 17 survivors and just over 4 years old at the time of the massacre, recalled in an 1875 statement that an 18th survivor was killed directly in front of the other children. At the close of the massacre, there was 18 children still alive. One girl, some 10 or 12 years old, they said was too big and could tell, so they killed her, leaving 17. The survivors were taken in by local Mormon families. 17 of the children were later reclaimed by the U.S. Army and returned to relatives in Arkansas. The treatment of these children while they were held by the Mormons is uncertain, but Captain James Lynch's statement in May 1859 said the surviving children were in a most wretched condition, half-starved, half-naked, filthy, infested with vermin, and their eyes diseased from the cruel neglect to which they had been exposed. Lynch's July 1859 affidavit added that when they first saw the children, they had little or no clothing and were covered with filth and dirt. Survivor Christopher Kit Fancher as an adult. Leonard J. Arrington, founder of the Mormon History Association, reports that Brigham Young received the writer James Haslam at his office on the same day. When he learned what was contemplated by the militia leaders in Parowan and Cedar City, he sent back a letter stating the Baker-Fancher Party was not to be meddled with and should be allowed to go in peace, although he acknowledged the Native Americans would likely do as they pleased. Young's letter arrived 2 days too late, on September 13, 1857. The livestock and personal property of the Baker-Fancher Party, including women's jewelry, clothing, and bedstuffs, were distributed or auctioned off to Mormons. Some of the surviving children saw clothing and jewelry that had belonged to their dead mothers and sisters subsequently being worn by Mormon women, and the journalist J.H. Beadle said that jewelry taken from Mountain Meadows was seen in Salt Lake City. Investigations and prosecutions. An early investigation was conducted by Brigham Young, who interviewed John D. Lee on September 29, 1857. In 1858, Young sent a report to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs stating that the massacre was the work of Native Americans. The Utah War delayed any investigation by the U.S. federal government until 1859, when Jacob Forney and U.S. Army Brevet Major James Henry Carleton conducted investigations. In Carleton's investigation, at Mountain Meadows he found women's hair tangled in sagebrush and the bones of children still in their mother's arms. Carleton later said it was a sight which can never be forgotten. After gathering up the skulls and bones of those who had died, Carleton's troops buried them and erected a cairn and cross. Carleton interviewed a few local Mormon settlers and Paiute Native American chiefs and concluded that there was Mormon involvement in the massacre. He issued a report in May 1859, addressed to the U.S. Assistant Adjutant General, setting forth his findings. Jacob Forney, Superintendent of Indian Affairs for Utah, also conducted an investigation that included visiting the region in the summer of 1859. Forney retrieved many of the surviving children of massacre victims who had been housed with Mormon families and gathered them up for transportation to their relatives in Arkansas. Forney concluded that the Paiutes did not act alone and the massacre would not have occurred without the white settlers, and Carleton's report to the U.S. Congress called the mass killings a heinous crime, blaming both local and senior church leaders for the massacre. In March 1859, Judge John Cradlebaugh, a federal judge brought into the territory after the Utah War, convened a grand jury in Provo concerning the massacre, but the jury declined any indictments. Nevertheless, Cradlebaugh conducted a tour of the Mountain Meadows area with a military escort. He attempted to arrest John D. Lee, Isaac Haight, and John Higbee, who fled before they could be found. Cradlebaugh publicly charged Brigham Young as an instigator to the massacre and therefore an accessory before the fact. Possibly as a protective measure against the mistrusted federal court system, Mormon Territorial Probate Court Judge Elias Smith arrested Young under a territorial warrant, perhaps hoping to divert any trial of Young into a friendly Mormon territorial court. Apparently because no federal charges ensued, Young was released. Further investigations were cut short by the American Civil War in 1861, but proceeded in 1871 when prosecutors obtained the affidavit of militia member Philip Klingensmith. Klingensmith had been a bishop and blacksmith from Cedar City. By the 1870s, however, he had left the church and moved to Nevada. Lee was arrested on November 7, 1874. Dame Philip Klingensmith, Elot Wilden, and George Adair Jr. were indicted and arrested while warrants to pursue the arrests of 4 others who had gone into hiding, Haight, Higbee, William C. Stewart, and Samuel Jukes, were being obtained. Klingensmith escaped prosecution by agreeing to testify. Brigham Young excommunicated some participants, including Haight and Lee, from the LDS Church in 1870. The U.S. posted bounties of $5,000, equivalent to $120,500 in 2023, each for the capture of Haight, Higbee, Stewart, and Klingensmith. Lee's first trial began on July 23, 1875, in Beaver, before a jury of 8 Mormons and 4 non-Mormons. One of Lee's defense attorneys was Enos D. Hogue, a former Territorial Supreme Court justice. The trial led to a hung jury on August 5, 1875. Lee's second trial began September 13, 1876, before an all-Mormon jury. The prosecution called Daniel Wells, Laban Morrill, Joel White, Samuel Knight, Samuel McMurdy, Nephi Johnson, and Jacob Hamblin. Lee also stipulated, against advice of counsel, that the prosecution be allowed to reuse the depositions of Young and Smith from the previous trial. Lee called no witnesses in his defense and was convicted. Lee was entitled under Utah territorial statute to choose the method of his execution from 3 possible options: hanging, firing squad, or decapitation. At sentencing, Lee chose to be executed by firing squad. In his final words before his sentence was carried out at Mountain Meadows on March 23, 1877, Lee said that he was a scapegoat for others involved. Brigham Young stated that Lee's fate was just, but it was not a sufficient blood atonement, given the enormity of the crime.